Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Hammer Frankenstein series with Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Now, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell came out in 1974, and this is the seventh and final film of the Hammer Frankenstein series. Sixth, if you don't include the Horror of Frankenstein, because that was made as sort of an attempted reboot of the series, and in fact, on the back of the box here, they actually call this the sixth installment of the series. I guess they mean all the ones with Peter Cushing in it. Now, the last few films in this series I reviewed with my friends Jeremy and John. I decided to fly solo with this review because there's actually a lot I want to say about this movie, because this is actually my favorite of the Hammer Frankenstein films. Now, I will include little short reviews from both John and Jeremy later on in this video. Now, this was, as I said, the final film of the Hammer Frankenstein series, and this was Terence Fisher's final film. Now, I think for a while this was considered to be the black sheep of the series, but honestly, I love this one. Now, you can tell that it's Hammer attempting to compete with other horror films that were coming out at the time, because it is a lot gorier than any of the previous installments, and it's a little bit sleazier as well, particularly with one character in the movie, the asylum director. Now, I don't think this movie did too well when it came out, but at the time, Hammer films were falling out of popularity. Like, at this point, you already had films like The Exorcist coming out, and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre would come out a few months later, but I think at the time, audiences were expecting more from horror films than the Hammer films were delivering on. And honestly, I think at the time, audiences felt a movie like this was just hopelessly anachronistic and outdated. Now, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell is a very interesting movie. It's a creepy film, but there's also something very melancholy about this movie as well, and it's also an extremely well-made film, but Terence Fisher was a great director. And the movie honestly comes off as sort of a weird crossover between the Frankenstein story and the Edgar Allan Poe story, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. Like, there's a lot of elements of the film that remind me of that story. Now, the plot of Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell is it follows a young doctor who is trained to follow in Frankenstein's footsteps, and he's actually trained to create life. He ends up getting arrested and sent away to an insane asylum, where apparently the courts also sent Victor Frankenstein years earlier. When he gets to the asylum, he discovers that Frankenstein has apparently died. But it turns out that Frankenstein is not dead, but he faked his death, and he's now free to come and go as he pleases, because he, for all intents and purposes, is the one running the asylum, because he has some shit on the director of the asylum, who is a despicable human being. So Frankenstein ends up taking this young doctor under his wing, but eventually the main character discovers that Frankenstein is up to his old experiments again, and he has actually created a creature from the remains of a brutish, animalistic patient who died while trying to escape from the asylum, and the young doctor starts helping out Frankenstein with this new experiment. Now, one of the patients at the asylum is a professor who is a mathematical genius and is very musically talented, and eventually this professor kills himself, so Frankenstein and the main character end up taking this professor's brain and putting it inside the body of this creature. But this ends up having dire consequences, and that's the basic plotline of Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Now, in the film, Peter Cushing reprises his role as Victor Frankenstein. Now, it appears that the film might be in continuity with Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. Now, that movie ended where Frankenstein was apparently killed in a fire, but in this film you find out that Frankenstein was in a fire years earlier and his hands were severely burned, so that is a possible continuity link with Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, but at this point in the series, they did kind of throw continuity out the window window, and each film in the Hammer Frankenstein series is more or less standalone. Now, Frankenstein is not as evil in this movie as he was in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. Actually, there are points in this movie where he's actually kind of noble, like he actually does stand up for the rights of the patients. But Frankenstein is still not a good guy in this movie because, now this is a spoiler, but it turns out that Frankenstein actually drove this professor to suicide so he could get the professor's brain. And also, if Frankenstein was truly a good person, he probably would have exposed the director of the asylum for the scumbag that he is, rather than just blackmailing him so he could have all this power at the asylum. So I still buy Victor Frankenstein in this movie as being the same Victor Frankenstein that we saw in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, but maybe he's just mellowed out a little bit over the years because he's gotten older. But I really liked Cushing's performance in this movie, and he adds a lot of really interesting nuances to the performance of Victor Frankenstein, and there's actually something kind of sad and melancholy about Victor Frankenstein in this movie. Now, one scene in the movie I really liked is there's a scene where Simon, the main character, tells Frankenstein a joke. And at first Frankenstein's like, what the hell are you talking about? And then he gets the joke and he starts laughing, but it's such a human laugh. Like, it's the laugh of a man who hasn't laughed in a long time. In the film, Shane Briant plays Dr. Simon Helder, the young doctor who's trying to follow in Frankenstein's footsteps. And as the film goes on, he starts to slowly realize that this man that he emulates might not only be evil, but also just as crazy as the other inmates at the asylum. Madeline Smith plays the character of Sarah, who's nicknamed Angel by the inmates at the asylum, and she's a really interesting character. John Stratton plays the sleazy asylum director, and he is a piece of shit in this movie. Like, I hated this character. Charles Lloyd-Pack plays the professor who eventually gets his brain put inside the body of the monster, and he is a very tragic character. And David Prowse plays the monster, who has a very simian look about him in this movie. Now, Prowse also played the Frankenstein monster, albeit a different version of the monster in The Horror of Frankenstein. And it's funny that both Peter Cushing and David Prowse would go on to be in Star Wars. Peter Cushing, of course, played Grand Moff Tarkin, and David Prowse played the body of Darth Vader. Now, I actually do think there are some deeper themes in this film, and some people might accuse me of overanalyzing the living fuck out of this movie, but hear me out. Like, I do think the title of the movie, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, is a very apt title because hell, I think, is a major theme in the film. Like, the same way that Lucifer broke God's laws and then was condemned to hell, Frankenstein broke society's laws and he was condemned to this asylum, which could be looked at as sort of a man-made hell. And the fact that Frankenstein eventually took over this asylum really brings to mind the line from Paradise Lost, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Also, hell is considered to be a place of constant repetition. Like in a lot of stories about hell, like Dante's Inferno, you see sinners condemned to repeat the same actions over and over again for all eternity. Also, I've heard a definition of insanity that insanity is basically repeating the same actions over and over again, expecting different results every time. And you know what happens at the end of this film when all is said and done and Frankenstein once again failed at his experiments? He just starts all over again. So the ending of the film shows Frankenstein trapped in a hell of his own creation. There are also some definite religious undertones in the film, like, at one point Frankenstein introduces a patient who actually believes that he's God, and then Frankenstein says he's not the first man to make this claim, and he probably won't be the last, and when Frankenstein says that, I can't help but to think that maybe he's referring to himself, because Frankenstein did try to be as God is. He tried to create life. And then you have the character of Sarah, who's nicknamed Angel, and she almost symbolizes that one ray of sunshine, that one spot of redemption, even in this man-made hell. Now, I'm sure Terence Fisher, if he were still alive, he would probably tell me I'm way overanalyzing the film, but then again, the original novel, Frankenstein, by Mary Shelley, had a lot of deeper themes in it. I guess the big difference would be, and this isn't to disparage Terence Fisher by any means, but Mary Shelley was legitimately an intellectual. You look at the people she knew, like Lord Byron and her husband, Percy Shelley, like, the book was clearly written to be sort of a philosophical piece, whereas when Terence Fisher made this movie, or any of the Hammer Frankenstein films, he probably approached it as a job's a job. So any deeper themes that might be in this movie might just be me reaching way deeper than was actually intended. But once again, I absolutely love Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, and people might disagree with me on this, but I actually think it's a good send-off to the series, and a good conclusion to the Hammer Frankenstein saga. Now, in the 80s, there was a film called The Bride, which was sort of a loose remake of The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, Hammer had nothing to do with that movie, but the reason I bring that movie up is I really do think if Hammer ever did their own version of Bride of Frankenstein, it probably would have been something like that movie. Now, recently there's been a film, I don't think it's been officially released yet, but I know it was shot. There's been a film called Sherlock Holmes vs. Frankenstein. Now, of course, there are hundreds of Frankenstein movies out there because the original novel is public domain, but the reason I bring that movie up is because Shane Briant actually plays the same character that he played in this movie in that movie. So if that movie is legitimately in continuity with this movie, technically, even though I don't think Hammer had anything to do with that, technically that movie would kind of count as part of this particular series of Frankenstein films. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to two short reviews on this film, recorded by my friends Jeremy and John.
I thought that Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell was another decent entry in the series. You know, it definitely had a lot more gore than previous entries. I especially enjoyed the scene where they removed the brain. That was perfectly gory. Peter Cushing is back, and he's great as always. Dr. Frankenstein is a little less evil than he was in the last one he was in. You know, he actually sticks up for the asylum inmates, which I thought was pretty heroic, you know, against the abuse. I also enjoyed the character of the corrupt asylum director. He was pretty entertaining. And, yeah, Dave Prowse is back as the monster, and he does a good job. I also liked the monster's voice. I don't know if that was Prowse's voice or some other actor's, but either way, it was pretty good. It was great to see Peter Cushing back one final time, and it's funny because this is the final Hammer Frankenstein movie, and yet the ending kind of leaves it open for a sequel, which unfortunately never happened. But you know, all in all, it's a pretty decent flick.
Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, it was okay. I mean, it wasn't like bad, or it wasn't like my favorite of them. It was just, I feel like at this point Hammer was like really just like going downhill. They were just out of ideas. Cushing does a good solid performance, and it's kind of funny how like Prowse and Cushing would go on to do like Star Wars a few years later, and Prowse is like the monster look. It looked like something you saw like out of a bad Planet of the Apes kind of film. Simon was okay. I mean, not a terrible character. Just not like one of my favorite like Hammer characters in the Hammer Frankenstein films.
I hope you enjoyed their takes on this movie. Now, the next franchise I'll be reviewing for Horror Month is the Bloodthirsty trilogy, which is a series of vampire films that was put out by Toho in the 1970s. So my next movie review will be on the first film of that trilogy, 1970's The Vampire Doll.